Mark pushed open the door to his new apartment, the hinges creaking in protest, as if they hadn't been moved in years. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the unsettlingly quiet space. The apartment was spacious yet had an oddly claustrophobic feel, with high ceilings that seemed to loom over him like silent sentinels. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, patterns barely visible under layers of dust and neglect. As he moved through the rooms, unpacking boxes and setting up his belongings, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was still, almost too still, and there was a peculiar chill that seemed to seep into his bones, despite the summer heat outside. He shrugged it off, blaming it on the exhaustion of the move and the unfamiliarity of the new place. The living room was dominated by an old, ornate mirror that hung above the fireplace. It was the kind of mirror that belonged in a grand mansion rather than a modest city apartment. The frame was intricately carved with patterns that seemed to writhe and twist in the dim light, creating an almost hypnotic effect. Mark found himself drawn to it, standing in front of it for longer than he intended, studying his reflection and the room behind him. He shook his head and chuckled softly. "Get a grip, Mark," he muttered to himself, turning away from the mirror. "It's just a piece of glass." As the evening wore on, Mark continued to unpack, the apartment gradually transforming into a semblance of a home. He worked until his muscles ached and his eyes grew heavy, then decided to call it a night. He made his way to the bedroom, casting one last glance at the mirror. For a brief moment he thought he saw a faint shadow flicker across its surface, but when he blinked, it was gone. Must be the light playing tricks, he reasoned, but the unease lingered. Sleep did not come easily. Mark tossed and turned, his mind replaying the events of the day and the strange feeling that had settled over him. Just as he was drifting off, a soft creak echoed through the apartment. He sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The silence that followed was almost more unnerving than the sound itself. Deciding that he was too tired to deal with any more oddities, Mark lay back down and closed his eyes. He tried to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of his neck, the feeling that he was being watched. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and he fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, Mark woke early, the events of the previous night already fading into the haze of sleep. He got up and went about his morning routine, trying to shake off the lingering unease. As he passed by the mirror on his way to the kitchen, he glanced at it out of habit and froze. Standing behind him, reflected in the glass, was a figure. It was shadowy and indistinct, more a suggestion of a person than an actual presence. Mark spun around, but the room was empty. He turned back to the mirror, his heart thudding in his chest, but the figure was gone. "Okay, that was weird," he said aloud, his voice shaky. "Just stress, that's all." But even as he tried to convince himself, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. Something was wrong with this apartment. And it wasn't just the mirror. Mark decided to go out for a while, hoping that some fresh air and a change of scenery would clear his head. As he left the apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving something behind, something that was watching him, waiting for him to return. And in the back of his mind, the image of the shadowy figure lingered, haunting his thoughts. The first night in the new apartment had left Mark unsettled, but he chalked it up to the stress of moving. By the time he finished setting up his kitchen, the sky had darkened into a blanket of oppressive clouds. The city lights outside flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows through the curtains. Mark decided to call it an early night, hoping sleep would put his nerves to rest. But sleep didn't come easy. The bed was unfamiliar, the room too quiet. Every creak of the building, every distant siren, seemed magnified in the silence. Mark tossed and turned, a growing sense of unease gnawing at the edges of his mind. The apartment's peculiar chill seemed to seep into his bones, keeping him from finding any comfort. Somewhere in the haze of half-sleep he heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, like the sound of fabric brushing against fabric. His eyes snapped open, heart pounding in his chest. The room was shrouded in darkness. but the whispering continued, a faint murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Mark sat up, straining to catch any sign of movement. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, but he couldn't make out the words. He fumbled for the bedside lamp, its harsh light flooding the room and banishing the shadows. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in their wake. With a sigh, Mark swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up. He needed water, or maybe something stronger. As he made his way to the kitchen, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every step he took echoed through the apartment, the sound bouncing off the walls like a ghostly footfall. He reached the living room and froze. In the dim light, he saw the multiple figures reflected in the mirror, standing motionless. They were dark, indistinct shapes, their features hidden in shadow. Mark's heart raced as he turned to look behind him, but the room was empty. Only the mirror showed the presence of the shadowy figures. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He took a hesitant step closer to the mirror, the figures remaining eerily still. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers just inches from the glass, and the figures vanished. The room behind him was once again empty, the only reflection his own pale, frightened face. "What the hell?" Mark whispered, his voice shaky. He backed away from the mirror, every nerve in his body screaming at him to run. But where would he go? This was his home now, no matter how unsettling it was. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the kitchen, pouring himself a generous amount. The liquid burned his throat, but the warmth was welcome. He needed to calm down, to think. Maybe he was just overtired, his mind playing tricks on him. But the whispers, the figures in the mirror, they felt too real to be mere figments of his imagination. Mark sat on the couch, staring at the mirror from a safe distance. His reflection stared back, the room behind him empty and still. He took another swig of whiskey, his mind racing. There had to be an explanation, something rational that he could hold on to. But deep down, he knew that whatever was happening was beyond the realm of the rational. The night dragged on, every minute stretching into an eternity. Mark's eyes grew heavy, the adrenaline wearing off. He fought to stay awake, afraid of what he might see if he closed his eyes. But exhaustion eventually won out, and he drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures and whispering voices. Morning came with a sense of relief, the sunlight banishing the night's terrors. But the unease lingered, a dark cloud hanging over Mark's thoughts. He knew he couldn't ignore what had happened, no matter how much he wanted to. There was something wrong with the mirror, something that defied explanation. And if he was going to stay in this apartment, he needed to find out what it was. Mark stood up, his body aching from the restless night. He glanced at the mirror, its surface reflecting the room in harmless daylight. But he couldn't forget the figures he had seen, the whispers he had heard. They were a mystery he needed to solve for his own sanity, if nothing else. As he prepared for the day, Mark resolved to investigate. He would start with the landlord, maybe look into the history of the apartment. There had to be answers out there, clues to explain the strange occurrences. And he would find them, no matter what it took. Mark couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled over him like a dark cloud. The figures in the mirror, the whispers in the night, they haunted his every waking moment. Determined to find answers, he decided to start with the building's landlord. "Mr." Saunders was an older man with a perpetual frown etched into his face. When Mark knocked on his door, the landlord answered with a gruff, "What can I do for you?" "I need to ask you about the apartment," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. "And about the mirror." Saunders' frown deepened. "What about it?" Mark took a deep breath. "Have there been incidents? Strange things happening?" For a moment, Saunders seemed to consider denying everything. Then he sighed. "You'd better come in." Saunders' apartment was a cluttered mess, filled with old furniture and stacks of yellowing newspapers. Mark sat on a worn armchair, the fabric threadbare and rough against his skin. Saunders remained standing, his eyes weary. "You're not the first tenant to ask about that mirror," Saunders began. "It's been in the building as long as I can remember. Some say it's cursed." "Cursed," Mark repeated, the word heavy with implications. "Yeah, a long time ago, this building was owned by a man named Elias Whitlock. Bit of a recluse, rumored to dabble in the occult. When he died, the mirror was found in his apartment, and it's been here ever since." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of strange things have happened? People see things. Shadows, figures that aren't there. Some hear voices. One woman swore the mirror showed her visions of the past, of things that happened in the building long before her time. Mark's mind raced. Did anyone ever get rid of it? Saunders shook his head. Tried to. The damn thing always found its way back. Some people think it's tied to the building, that moving it would only make things worse. Mark left Saunders' apartment with more questions than answers. Determined to dig deeper, he headed to the local library. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, helped him find records and old newspapers related to Elias Whitlock and the building's history. Hours passed as Mark pored over the documents. Whitlock had indeed been a notorious figure in the late 19th century. Known for his eccentricities, he was rumored to have been involved in dark rituals. His death was shrouded in mystery, and many believed he had cursed the mirror, trapping souls within it as part of his twisted experiments. As Mark read, he felt a growing sense of urgency. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was far from comforting. He realized that the figures he had seen in the mirror were likely the trapped souls of those who had fallen victim to Whitlock's dark practices. Returning to his apartment, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The mirror loomed ominously, its ornate frame seeming to twist and writhe in the dim light. He knew he had to confront whatever was inside it, to find a way to release the trapped souls and end the curse once and for all. That night the whispers started earlier, a soft murmur that grew louder as the hours passed. Mark sat in front of the mirror, armed with the knowledge he had gathered. He spoke to the figures, asking them who they were and how he could help them. At first there was no response. But as the night wore on, the figures began to take shape, their features becoming clearer. One by one, they told their stories, lives cut short, dreams unfulfilled, all trapped by Whitlock's malevolent curse. Mark's resolve hardened. He couldn't let their suffering continue. He remembered something he had read about rituals to banish spirits and break curses. He would need specific items: candles, salt, a piece of Whitlock's belongings. The latter would be the hardest to find, but Mark was determined. The next morning he visited an antique shop known for its oddities. The shopkeeper, an eccentric man with a knowing smile, listened to Mark's request without surprise. "Ah, Elias Whitlock," he said, rummaging through a back room. "A dark legacy, that one." He returned with a small box. Inside was a silver locket. This belonged to Whitlock. It should serve your purpose. Mark took the locket, feeling a strange energy emanating from it. He thanked the shopkeeper and headed back to his apartment, his mind focused on the task ahead. As night fell, Mark prepared for the ritual. He placed candles around the mirror, forming a protective circle with the salt. Holding the locket, he began to chant the incantation he had memorized, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The figures in the mirror began to stir, their faces contorted in anguish. The room grew cold, and the whispers turned to wails. Mark continued the chant, pouring all his will into the words. The mirror's surface shimmered, the figures inside writhing as if in pain. Suddenly, a blinding light filled the room. The mirror cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across its surface. The wails reached a crescendo, then stopped abruptly. The light faded, and the room was plunged into silence. Mark stood there, breathless and trembling. The mirror was shattered, its power broken. He knew the trapped souls were finally free. Exhausted but relieved, he collapsed onto the couch, the locket still clutched in his hand.
He had done it. He had broken the curse. But as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, he couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the apartment held, and whether he had truly seen the last of Elias Whitlock's dark legacy.
The days following the ritual were a blur for Mark. Despite his exhaustion, he couldn't afford to rest. He had managed to break the mirror, but the malevolent presence lingering in the apartment suggested that his work was far from over. The spirits were free, but the dark energy that bound them was still palpable, and it seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Mark pored over ancient texts and obscure websites, looking for any hint of how to permanently banish the spirits. He barely slept, the whispers growing louder and more insistent every night. The mirror may have been shattered, but the apartment had become a battleground, a place where the line between the living and the dead had worn perilously thin. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the apartment, Mark prepared himself for the final confrontation. He had gathered protective charms, drawn intricate sigils on the walls, and memorized the incantations that would, he hoped, finally banish the spirits. The air was thick with tension as Mark lit the candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shapes on the walls. He stood in the center of the room, holding a talisman in one hand and a small, ancient book in the other. The whispers had grown into a cacophony of voices, filling the room with a chorus of despair and anger. Mark took a deep breath and began the incantation, his voice steady but filled with determination. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and he could see his breath misting in the air. The shadows on the walls seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing as if in pain. As he chanted, the spirits materialized around him, their forms more defined and their expressions more menacing than before. They reached out with ethereal hands, their eyes filled with a hunger that sent chills down Mark's spine. But he held his ground, focusing on the words that would banish them forever. One of the spirits, a tall figure with hollow eyes and tattered clothes, stepped forward. Its voice cut through the others, a low, guttural growl. "You cannot banish us. We are bound to this place, to the darkness that created us." Mark's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't falter. "You were trapped by Whitlock, but his power over you is broken. You don't belong here." The spirit hissed, a sound like steam escaping from a boiling pot. "We will never leave." Mark raised the talisman, its surface glowing with a soft, otherworldly light. "I command you to depart from this place. Return to the shadows from whence you came." The spirit recoiled, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. The other spirits surged forward, their collective wail reaching a deafening pitch. Mark's voice rose above the din, the incantation flowing from his lips like a torrent. The room erupted in a blinding light, the spirits' forms dissolving into mist. The force of their departure sent Mark staggering backward, the book and talisman falling from his hands. He hit the floor hard, the breath knocked out of him. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the temperature began to rise, the oppressive chill lifting as if a weight had been removed from the air. Mark lay there, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had done it. The spirits were gone, their presence banished from the apartment. But as he struggled to his feet, he knew this victory had come at a great cost. The apartment was a wreck, the walls scorched where the sigils had been drawn, the air still thick with the residue of the supernatural battle. He moved through the apartment, extinguishing the candles and picking up the remnants of his tools. The mirror's shattered pieces lay scattered across the floor, glittering like shards of ice. Mark knelt down and picked up a piece, its surface reflecting his weary face. He could see the toll the confrontation had taken on him, the dark circles under his eyes, the lines of strain etched into his skin. But there was also a sense of relief, a weight lifted from his shoulders. The spirits were gone, and the apartment felt different, still quiet and finally at peace. He knew he would need to clean up and repair the damage, but for the first time in days he felt a glimmer of hope. As he looked around the room, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. He had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. The spirits were free, and Whitlock's legacy had been put to rest. Mark took a deep breath, the air now clear and free of the oppressive energy that had plagued him. The apartment was his home, and it was time to reclaim it from the shadows. Exhausted but resolute, Mark began the slow process of restoring his apartment, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, he had the strength to face them. He had confronted the darkness and won, and now he could finally find peace. In the days following the final confrontation, Mark worked tirelessly to restore his apartment. The physical damage was easy enough to fix: new paint, some plaster, a few trips to the hardware store. But the lingering sense of unease, the feeling that something was still watching, was harder to dispel. He knew he had to understand more about the mirror and its dark legacy to truly move on. One evening, while sorting through the remnants of the shattered mirror, Mark discovered a hidden compartment in the mirror's ornate frame. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. It belonged to Elias Whitlock. Mark sat down at the kitchen table, the journal before him. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the room, giving the air a sense of expectancy. He opened the journal and began to read. The entries were a mix of mundane observations and chilling accounts of Whitlock's experiments with the supernatural. As he read, a pattern began to emerge. Whitlock had been obsessed with capturing souls, believing they held the key to immortality. He had used the mirror as a portal, trapping spirits within it and drawing power from their suffering. The journal detailed the rituals he used, the sacrifices he made, and the twisted satisfaction he derived from his dark deeds. But one entry stood out. Whitlock wrote of a prophecy, a warning that one day, a person with the ability to interact with the supernatural would come to the apartment. This individual would have the power to either perpetuate Whitlock's dark legacy or to finally break the curse and free the trapped souls. Mark realized with a start that he was that person. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. His presence in the apartment wasn't a coincidence. He had been drawn here by forces he didn't fully understand, guided by a fate intertwined with Whitlock's dark history. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place: his latent ability to sense the supernatural, the increasing intensity of the hauntings, the final confrontation. Mark knew what he had to do. The spirits had been freed, but the dark energy Whitlock had harnessed still lingered. He had to perform one last ritual to cleanse the apartment and break the curse once and for all. And he needed help. He reached out to Sarah, a friend who dabbled in the occult and had helped him with research before. When she arrived, she carried a bag filled with herbs, crystals, and other ritualistic items. Together, they prepared the apartment, creating a sacred space to conduct the cleansing ritual. As they worked, the apartment seemed to come alive, the shadows shifting and twisting as if in protest. Mark could feel the dark energy pushing back, resisting their efforts. But he was determined. He wouldn't let Whitlock's legacy continue to poison this place. When everything was ready, they began the ritual. Sarah chanted in a low, steady voice, her words weaving a protective barrier around them. Mark followed the instructions in Whitlock's journal, using the herbs and crystals to draw out the dark energy and contain it. The air grew thick with tension, the shadows around them growing darker and more oppressive. Mark's voice shook as he recited the incantation, but he pushed through, his determination unwavering. He could feel the energy building, a storm of supernatural forces swirling around them. As the ritual reached its climax, the apartment seemed to shudder, the walls vibrating with the intensity of the dark energy being drawn out. The candles flickered wildly, their flames almost extinguished by the force of the ritual. But Mark and Sarah held their ground, their voices rising above the chaos, Suddenly there was a blinding flash of light, and a deafening roar filled the room. The dark energy condensed into a swirling vortex, then exploded outward, dissipating into the ether. The apartment fell silent, the oppressive weight lifted. Mark and Sarah stood there, breathless and trembling. The air was clear, the shadows gone. The dark energy that had plagued the apartment was no more. Mark felt a profound sense of relief, a weight lifted from his shoulders. As they cleaned up, Sarah turned to Mark, her eyes filled with awe. "You did it, Mark. You broke the curse." Mark nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment and peace. "We did it." "Thank you, Sarah." With the apartment finally cleansed, Mark felt like he could truly start anew. The legacy of Elias Whitlock had been put to rest, and the trapped souls were free. He knew that his journey with the supernatural wasn't over, but for now he could enjoy the peace he had fought so hard to achieve. The apartment was his home, and it was finally free from the shadows of the past. Mark took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on his face. For the first time in weeks, he felt truly at peace. The final showdown had left Mark drained but determined. He knew there was still one last thing he had to do to ensure the dark energy never returned. The apartment was now quiet, almost eerily so, as if it held its breath, waiting for the final act. Mark spent the next few days gathering his strength and preparing for the ultimate cleansing ritual. He researched every possible method, consulting with Sarah and other experts, ensuring that this time the darkness would be banished for good. On the night of the ritual, a storm raged outside, lightning flashing and thunder rumbling like an omen. Mark set up the apartment meticulously, creating a protective circle in the center of the living room. The candles were lit, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and the air was thick with the scent of burning sage and incense. Mark stood in the center of the circle, the mirror shards arranged around him in a pattern of protection. He held the locket, Whitlock's dark talisman, in his hand, ready to destroy it and sever the final link to the cursed past. Sarah stood outside the circle, ready to assist if needed, her face a mask of concentration. Mark began the incantation, his voice steady and strong. The air grew heavy, the temperature dropping sharply as the shadows in the room seemed to gather, coalescing into darker forms. The apartment vibrated with a malevolent energy, pushing against the protective circle, but Mark's resolve held firm. As he continued the chant, the shadows began to writhe and twist, their forms taking shape. The spirits that had been freed from the mirror returned, their faces contorted with rage and pain. They surged toward Mark, but the protective circle held them at bay. "You cannot defeat us," a voice hissed, echoing through the apartment. It was Whitlock, his spirit manifesting from the darkness, his eyes burning with a malevolent light. "This place will always be mine." Mark's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't falter. "Your reign of terror ends tonight, Whitlock. Your victims will finally be free." He raised the locket, the silver glinting in the candlelight. With a final, powerful incantation, he called upon the spirits of those trapped by Whitlock's curse. The room filled with a brilliant light, the shadows recoiling as the spirits rose against their tormentor. The light grew brighter, blinding, as the spirits attacked Whitlock, their combined energy overwhelming his dark presence. The locket heated in Mark's hand, burning with an intense heat. With a final shout, he smashed the locket against the floor, the silver shattering into a million pieces. The explosion of energy was instantaneous. The shadows screamed, a deafening roar that shook the apartment to its core. The light engulfed everything, and for a moment Mark thought he might be consumed by it. But then, just as suddenly, the light faded, leaving the apartment in a profound silence. Mark stood there, panting, his body trembling with exhaustion. The shadows were gone, the air clear and fresh. The oppressive weight that had hung over the apartment was lifted, replaced by a serene calm. The spirits were free, and Whitlock's dark legacy was finally destroyed. Sarah rushed to Mark's side, her eyes wide with relief and awe. "You did it, Mark. It's over." Mark nodded, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment and peace. "We did it, Sarah. Thank you." They spent the next few hours cleaning up, the remnants of the ritual swept away like the last traces of a nightmare. As the storm outside subsided, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light into the apartment. Mark looked around, feeling a sense of renewal. The apartment, once a battleground of supernatural forces, was now a place of peace and light. He knew his journey with the supernatural wasn't over, but for now he could rest. He walked to the window, looking out at the city bathed in the soft glow of morning. For the first time in weeks, he felt truly free. The shadows of the past had been banished, and the future lay open before him, filled with possibilities. Turning back to Sarah, he smiled. "Let's get some breakfast. I think we've earned it." As they left the apartment, Mark felt a sense of closure. The mirror, the spirits, Whitlock's curse, it was all behind him now. He was free to live his life, unburdened by the darkness that had once threatened to consume him. And as the door closed behind them, the apartment stood silent and serene, a testament to the power of courage and determination in the face of unimaginable darkness.